Hello, everybody. Welcome to our final chapter of Unit 5, Chapter 18, all about the period of history known as Reconstruction. As usual, this is going to take about 20-ish minutes, although I'll probably go over time just a little bit to explain a few things in a bit more in detail. Reconstruction is a very controversial period of American history, and unfortunately, it is a tragedy. It's a tragedy in that it's going to fail. A lot of ideas were suggested, not a lot of ideas actually end up getting implemented. Now, let's go ahead and dive into that. The lesson topics right there, Reconstruction covers topics 5.10 and 5.11 right there. Now, this is something that you would not necessarily need to know for the AP, although there's a couple of words that I do want to bring up here. Reconstruction is hotly debated exactly what its purpose was, exactly its intentions, and its successes as well. Now, kind of the first group of historians to look at Reconstruction as a historical time period, they're known as the radical historians. They include guys like Albion Torgey. They include guys like W.E.B. Du Bois as well. And these radical historians, they largely viewed Reconstruction as a period of time that was necessary, a time to potentially change the South and make it into a much more equitable place. They are kind of like former abolitionists, many of them, or at least people sympathetic to that idea of immediate racial equality. And therefore, they believed in using the weight of the federal government to actually change those things. The problem with these radical historians is that they largely take a pessimistic view that change was needed. And it's a shame that all of this stuff ended, but maybe it was hopeless to even try. Maybe white supremacy is so ingrained in the United States' identity that maybe it was impossible to try and change that. Fast forward into the Dunning School of Historiography. The Dunning School were Southern historians, but they were influential in the North as well, who kind of portray Reconstruction not as something that should be praised and something that wasn't necessary, something that should be viewed as an evil. Reconstruction was the North being sore winners, basically. They were making the South change its ways, and that the South was being abused by the North, Northerners, radicals who didn't understand that the South needed to be eased into these changes. There was a horrific war that many Southerners died. Why should we change everything so rapidly? Why should we instigate further sectional conflict? And kind of in the Dunning School of Historiography, they really point out a couple of villains in American history and Reconstruction history. There's the carpetbaggers, Northerners who went down into the South to take advantage of economic and political opportunities, Southerners, Southern traders who joined the party of Lincoln, the party of the Union, the party of the North, the Republican Party. These Southern traders, they were the scalawags. But ultimately, it was necessary for these groups to be defeated by the Redeemers. These were politicians against Reconstruction. Now, the Dunning School was largely a racist kind of interpretation, thinking that, well, Reconstruction was bad and horrible, and all of the things that were related to it were kind of the North imposing its will on the South. The North didn't give its black citizens the equal right to vote until they were forced to by constitutional amendment. The Reconstruction era South had to do those stuff. Kind of, we do see that this Dunning School, this pessimistic look on Reconstruction as a tragedy, that it was even attempted, is largely going to be challenged by revisionists. Revisionist historians are going to say that old thesis was wrong. Let's revise it. Reconstruction was actually good, and it's going to debunk a lot of claims that the South was being abused by the North. The North didn't make the South accept black politicians. There was only like 15% of them anyway. Very small amount of people, all things considered. But especially more in the present day, you do see this return to radical historiography in a way. You do see this kind of pessimism, this idea of Reconstruction was necessary, yet sadly it failed. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's actually talk about the period itself. Now, there are three distinct phases of Reconstruction that historians have identified. The first phase is how the executive branch handled it. You see that initially, it was intended that the president, in addition to his wartime powers, in addition to Lincoln's wartime powers, he would also be the one who handles how the South is reintegrated into the Union. So, in this early phase of Reconstruction, we're going to take a look at how the presidency evolved in how it wanted to treat the South. Now, Lincoln has a couple of plans, even before the end of the war, of how to restore Southern states back into the Union. How do we make sure that these states kind of accept federal control, but also institute some changes? Well, actually, Lincoln didn't really want that many changes. He wanted the South to accept the 13th Amendment. That was a given. Enough states had ratified it that the South was kind of forced to. But beyond that, Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was what is known as the 10% plan. Basically, the 10% plan would have said 10% of the state's voting population needed to sign a loyalty oath. If that happened, the state could rejoin the Union, no problem. And actually, Lincoln vetoed more radical proposals that were designed to actually make the South do some stuff, do some changes. For example, Lincoln is going to veto the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill, it kind of was like the 10% plan, except it was much more strict on the South. What it required was that 50% of the state's population had to swear loyalty, but they also had to promise that they never ever were bad boys and girls, that they never took up arms against the Union. Now, that's kind of an impossible task. If you want to reach that 50% mark, you're not going to get there if you just consider one group of people to be able to vote. Because the Wade-Davis bill had the implication of saying to states, if you want to rejoin the state, if you want to rejoin the Confederacy, the Union faster, if you want to become states again, well, you actually have to institute a couple of changes. You need to have black votes because honestly, 50% of the state's population couldn't honestly say they weren't ever involved with the Confederacy. However, African Americans could say, we weren't involved with the Confederacy. If the states wanted to rejoin the Union, maybe they needed to extend black suffrage. Lincoln views this as a little bit of a bridge too far. He vetoes it. Now, Lincoln unfortunately never gets to carry out his Reconstruction plans, and instead we get his stupid vice president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson becomes the 17th president after Lincoln has a mind-blowing experience at the theater. But Johnson is, well, he's a complicated guy. Johnson hated the Confederacy. He hated rich white people in the South because he felt that they led his home state of Tennessee astray. Johnson was the only senator to remain loyal to the Union from the Confederacy. But anyway, Johnson, as president, he is going to kind of say, yeah, you know what? I don't want to see the political power of these white Southern planters, but I don't want equal rights for black people either. So, what were Johnson's plans for Reconstruction? Well, Johnson did require that the states kind of have to repeal any of their secession declarations. States as well, Confederate leaders, Confederate politicians, if they wanted to be granted citizenship rights, they needed to beg for a presidential pardon. But in addition, Johnson also is going to argue for the 13th Amendment. The reason why is not because he believes in abolishing racial distinctions between white and black people. He believes that slavery was key to rich white Southern planters' power. So he believes, let's take away that key to their, whiteness and, well, richness, I should say. But in kind of place of of slavery, that's when Johnson kind of tells Southern states to issue out black codes. Black codes were laws that unfairly discriminated against African Americans, and the intent of the black codes was to keep African Americans on plantations. Black codes included things like apprenticeship laws, laws that basically said you must be employed if you live in the South. If you aren't, you could be arrested. And kind of Southern planters are going to say, black people, I don't want you to get arrested. Why don't you come work for me? I will give you a apprenticeship. Now, this apprenticeship is basically lifelong and, you might get paid a minimum wage, but it's very restrictive, these black codes. Not only do they have these kind of work requirements that force African Americans to find work wherever they can, and the places that were available for work were just plantations. But these black codes also restricted civil liberties. They essentially are going to deny basic fundamental rights for African Americans, gathering in groups of three or more in some cases, owning guns, First Amendment rights. They could be easily beaten back by either the law enforcement or, unfortunately, more prominently, the Ku Klux Klan as well. Because the effect of Johnson's plan is that nothing really changes in the South. We do see that Johnson kind of lets the Southern states back into the country very easily. They pass the 13th Amendment. They do institute the Black Codes, but not much changes. We do see the kind of the rise of the KKK, for example, and the KKK is designed really as a extra military, a paramilitary force to make sure that Black Americans are subservient to white Americans, especially in the South. We see that systems of sharecropping emerge. Kind of, we do see that former slaves, oftentimes without a lot of economic opportunities given to them, they're going to remain on their same plantations. They're going to engage in a system of sharecropping, which essentially is a system in which a former slave is going to rent out land from a rich white planter in payment for that rent. That's when the former slaves give a share of what they produce to the white plantation owner. The problem always is that the value of the crops produced is never enough to pay off that rent completely. So what happens is the sharecroppers, they are going to kind of enter into another season of labor, another season of labor, another season, another season, another season, another season. It's essentially a cycle of debt slavery. That's what sharecropping is. So nothing much changes because of this initial very lenient policy of Reconstruction handled by President Johnson. And this is going to horrify some Northerners. Northerners who fought the Civil War are going to say, we fought this war to end slavery. Lincoln told us this war was to end slavery, and now basically slavery has returned. So that leads us to the second phase of Reconstruction, Congressional Reconstruction. Now, there are different factions within Congressional Reconstruction. The most important for our purposes is going to be the guys known as the Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans. And the main leader of that group was a guy named Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens believed in complete equality between white and black people, and he believed the Civil War was fought for that equality. And as such, we needed to have policies that instituted actual political and economic equality. The radicals, they believed in radical things like land redistribution, punishing former Confederates, and constant military protection for African Americans. However, not every single Republican agreed with Thaddeus Stevens. We do see more moderate Republicans. Kind of, these are Republicans who are going to carry on Lincoln's moderation. And yet they do believe some changes are necessary. The KKK's violence is too horrific. African Americans are still involved in debt slavery. Maybe some change needs to happen. But before that change happens, Congress kind of takes up on itself the responsibility of Reconstruction. For example, to assist African Americans economically, that's when we see the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was technically first authorized under President Lincoln, but it's really going to kind of take off in the after his death. What is the Freedmen's Bureau? It is a government agency that essentially provided education, free housing, and food sort of welfare program, if you will, for recently freed African Americans. The intent was to raise literacy, education was especially important, but also to provide economic independence, kind of break the cycle of sharecropping in the South. Now, the other law that Congress is going to adopt is something called the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was an attempt to kind of curb those black codes. The black codes unfairly discriminated based on race. What the Civil Rights Act is going to do is say that regardless of race, every person born in the United States is a citizen. Now, both of these things are offered up to Johnson to sign into law. What does Johnson do? Johnson vetoes them. But Congress has enough supporters that actually what Congress does is that a team of moderates and radicals, they team up to override the presidential veto. Now, this is the first time that's ever happened in American history, and it does begin a very antagonistic relationship between Congress and President Andrew Johnson. Realizing that Johnson might veto future laws and realizing that Congress might not always have a two-thirds majority Republican dominance, we do see that eventually the 14th Amendment is proposed and is going to be passed by the Congress in 1866. The 14th Amendment has a lot of different working parts to it, and some of them are not going to be listened to. But the 14th Amendment kind of basically says the following things. One, it establishes birthright citizenship. That directly overturns the Dred Scott decision's view that black people were never intended to be citizens. It establishes that all citizens are entitled to basic equal protections under the law. All citizens are entitled to protections that are listed in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, as written back in the 1790s, only existed to protect citizens from the federal government. What the 14th Amendment does is that it says, you know what, state governments also can't take away these rights. It's a direct contradiction of the black codes. Indeed. Yes, you're a baby. Did you know that? Yes, you are. However, we also see the 14th Amendment also does things to exclude former Confederates from Congress. You see, under Johnson's all-white governments, the Confederacy largely had a lot of its leaders still represented in the federal government. But what the 14th Amendment does is that it grants Congress the ability to pardon people accused of insurrection and treason. And it turns out Congress is going to exclude most of these former Confederate politicians. Some of them do become scalawags and are Republicans, but most of them are going to be banned from Congress. God bless America. Now, the 14th Amendment is pretty radical, but we do see that eventually Congress is going to tell Johnson, LOL, you shouldn't have any authority whatsoever. We're going to have actually the end of all of your proposals in the kind of plans that you instigated, and we're going to have our own Reconstruction Acts. Bleh, bleh, bleh. You're a baby. Now, what do the Reconstruction Acts do? The Reconstruction Acts are going to kind of overturn the restored white governments that Johnson created, and it is going to set up and it is going to set up the South into 5 military districts. Now, in each of these districts, there's going to be a Union General. This Union General is going to be responsible for organizing new state governments. And kind of these new state governments, in order to restore all federal privileges, they have to make some changes. They have to write new state constitutions that actually guarantee a sense of equality. They have to ratify the 14th Amendment, and they have to adopt that 50% loyalty pledge. Essentially, they do have to adopt the Wade Davis bill. Now, this is kind of going to set up the next stage of Reconstruction, actually, is that now that these military governors, now that these military governors are building state governments, now we'll take a look at what that looks like more in a second. But eventually, to kind of further secure Congress's control over Reconstruction, that explains the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is convicted. Oh, I forgot to set a timer. Oh my God, you are being so cute right now, Claude. Look at him. Shh. Do you see him? Look up here. Look up here. Oh, yes, you're a baby. I love you. All right. Anyway, Johnson's impeached. He's never convicted of a crime. He's never removed from office because of one stupid vote. Anyway, Eventually, Johnson is no longer president, and our next president is Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses Simpson Grant. Actually, the S doesn't stand for anything, but whatever. Grant is largely a do nothing president in a way because he mostly lets Congress do its thing. Now, Grant is actually going to get elected by the in the election of 1868, which is the first time that black people could vote in elections. The South, under this kind of 50% plan, if they wanted to reach that loyalty pledge, they needed to actually grant African Americans the right to vote. And in the first election of 1868, when black people could vote, most of them vote for Ulysses S. Grant, the party of Lincoln, the party of the Republicans, the party of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, this is going to make Republicans warm up to the idea of maybe extending the right to vote nationwide. That leads us to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment grants universal suffrage for all men, regardless of race. You have to be over 21, but regardless of race, all men can vote. Guess who can't vote, Claude? Women. So both of us is okay. No, I'm just kidding. That's bad. Women are not going to be included in the 15th Amendment, obviously. And it does unfortunately lead to a rift in the women's rights movement and the African American civil rights movement. Because beforehand, in the age of Unit 4 and kind of the pre-Civil War period, there was a lot of agreement, areas of agreement between African American civil rights and for women's rights. However, that largely ends with the 15th Amendment. African American men are granted the right to vote, but not women. That alienates a lot of former supporters of the movement for African American rights and for women's rights. That's going to become a bigger deal in our next couple of units. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at the state government level. Now, on the state government level, these states are actually going to begin the process of democracy, you could say. That's the first experiment in multiracial democracy, to quote Eric Foner. Now, the Reconstruction Acts are going to set up small d democratic governments. These democratic governments with a small d are actually going to be dominated by Republicans, actually. African Americans oftentimes compose a huge majority in a lot of these southern states, and we do see that most black men, they're going to vote for the Republican Party. As such, we see that these state governments under the Reconstruction Acts are mostly filled with Republicans. Now, the problem with these Republican state governments, even though they do things like rewrite state constitutions to be more legally inclusive, even though they begin kind of state funding for education programs, even though they do rebuild infrastructure lost from the Civil War, the problem is a lot of poor whites don't like these Republican governments. They accuse them of corruption. They are mistrustful of increased taxes that are needed to pay for all these programs, education, infrastructure, etc. And kind of we do see that there is this mass white mobilization against these Republican state governments, and that's what we call the Mississippi Plan. The Mississippi Plan generally describes efforts by white Southerners to dislodge Republican Reconstruction state governments. Basically, the intent is intimidate Republican voters, again, mostly African Americans, from actually voting. And actually, the Mississippi Plan, unfortunately, is going to be successful. We'll take a look at that more in a second. In response to this rise of Klan activity, into the response to this Mississippi Plan, we do see that Grant is going to respond with the KKK bill, with the KKK, aka the Force Acts. Now, unfortunately, the Force Acts, which are intended to use the military to protect African Americans from groups that would infringe upon their basic citizenship rights, including the right to vote, unfortunately for African Americans, Grant rarely uses this power. He has the power to do it, but he rarely does. The other problem with these state reconstruction acts, these kind of state reconstruction governments, is that they fail to address the economic situation. Because yes, slaves are no longer slaves. African Americans are free. The problem is they didn't solve things like sharecropping. It kind of maintained African American dependence on former slave owners for economic livelihood, economic opportunity. So in a sense, slavery kind of doesn't go away. Sharecropping is a major labor source in the South, arguably until the First World War, and you could even argue until World War II, actually. Now, unfortunately, Reconstruction is going to end. And why does it end? Well, unfortunately, we do see that things like the Mississippi Plan are going to work. We'll talk about that more in a second. But Northerners are generally going to grow tired of using and supporting a strong federal government. Kind of think about American history as a constant swing between times when there's more laissez-faire and times when there's a strict federal government. The Civil War and Reconstruction was a time of a strong federal government, but what kind of swings is a time of more state, local power. And kind of eventually, Northerners wane in terms of their interest in actually making changes, of using federal resources to do all these programs in the South, of funding the Freedmen's Bureau, of funding continual military protection in the South to protect black voters. We need to move on. We can't just keep waving the bloody shirt. We can't just bring up the past. We can't just focus on all of these changes in the South. Let's move on. Let's focus on westward expansion. Let's focus on transcontinental railroads. Let's focus on industry and oil and machinery and steel. Reconstruction is a thing of the past. Just move on. Even if that means black people are going to be left to southern states. We also see that kind of efforts designed to protect African Americans largely going to be declared unconstitutional, actually, thanks to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to have a very narrow definition of the 14th Amendment, and, well, they're going to say, even though it is designed to protect equal citizenship rights, actually, on paper, no, it's not. We do see that there's a series of Supreme Court cases. There are the civil rights cases, for example, in the 1880s. Basically, what these cases are going to do is that they declare a lot of federal programs for civil rights to be unconstitutional. They're an overexpansion of federal government power. As you're going to see, especially from the 1870s up to the 1900s, there is a big belief that the federal government maybe shouldn't have that much power. We should have a more laissez-faire approach to the economy and, unfortunately, towards civil rights as well. The Mississippi Plan, unfortunately, is going to be successful in intimidating black voters to not vote. Kills. We see the murder of African Americans. We see the death and destruction of African American neighborhoods. It's absolutely horrific. Essentially, all of these Reconstruction governments eventually are going to be handed over to the Democratic white supremacist party, the Democratic Party. And that, unfortunately, is going to mean that these state governments, they're going to pass things like literacy tests, things that technically don't discriminate based on race, but are intended to limit black participation. So we do see that there's the return of the solid white South. Democratic Party rule returns to these places. But ultimately, the thing that ends Reconstruction flat out is the presidential election in 1876. I should have underlined that. But this presidential election is going to be between the Republican Hayes and Tilden. Tilden promises to end any federal support for Reconstruction, especially by removing any remaining troops in the South. Remember, those troops were there to protect black people, but they were viewed as an occupying force by white Southerners. Hayes is a bit more sympathetic towards Reconstruction, but he really wants to be president, guys. Now, initially, it seems like Tilden wins this election. However, there are disputed results in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Now, these three states had high amounts of corruption. They had a high amount of violence and fraud. There's a recount that happens. There's an investigation that happens by an electoral commission. This electoral commission finds that actually Hayes won these three states. And in winning these three states, Hayes wins the Electoral College by one vote. He loses the popular vote, but wins by one Electoral College vote. Now, the South genuinely is thinking about civil war again, and most Americans are saying, I don't want another civil war, guys. My brother lost his arm. My son died. I can't take another civil war. So in order to prevent any bloodshed, that's when we get the Compromise of 1877. It includes things like Hayes has to appoint a Southerner into his cabinet. Hayes is the president. The South has to accept that. But Hayes is going to have to support the end of Reconstruction, namely by removing any remaining federal troops in the South. And kind of without this protection from the federal government, Southern states are free to do what they want with black citizens. That leads to Jim Crow segregation. That leads to restrictive voting laws. It leads to cultural and social practices like lynching. All right. Well, on that very somber note, that is the end of Reconstruction right there. Thank you. I think I went a little bit over time. Have an excellent day. I apologize for if this went over time. All right. So with that, let us stop the music. Stop the show. I know what you're saying. Please don't stop the music, but I'm not Rihanna. Bye bye. And